Hey, all you literary legends and luminaries. I'm Julie, and welcome to another episode of Booksmart. Today we are revisiting a classic, a creepy classic. It's Helter Skelter, the true story of the Manson Murders by Vincent Bugliosi. First off, let me announce that this will be a pop-up free episode. No cats. Many of you who watched my chaos video, which premiered a couple of years ago, complained about the cats. I still get complaints about the cats from that video. Since this is another Charles Manson episode, I'm foregoing the cats. Now I'll see how many people ask for the cats back. My Helter Skelter book was the fifth printing of the paperback in October 1975. It's pretty beat up. The book was first published in 1974. The copy I have is my mother's. She obviously bought it once it went into paperback. Let me give you a little background to give you context of my relationship with Helter Skelter. I first read it when I was in 7th grade, maybe 8th grade. I read far beyond my years, obviously. My parents spoke often of historical events, although the true crime that was much closer to our home in the Midwest was Richard Speck, who killed 8 student nurses. Adults were checking the barns and other buildings on the farm. I distinctly remember my parents sharing those stories about how scary it was. In 6th grade, I traded in my Sweet Valley Twins books for V.C. Andrews books. That led me to reading Stephen King and a whole bunch of stuff that was nowhere close to young adult fiction. By 7th grade, I had become obsessed with LA Law and the made-for-TV movies that were based on true stories, and particularly adored Lifetime for playing such movies over and over again. The Burning Bed, the Tracy Thurman story, and the Hillside Stranglers. I watched those all the time. I wanted to be a prosecutor, and then once I watched The Lives of Trudy Chase, my mom bought me the book When Rabbit House, which I still have today too. I wanted to be a forensic psychologist. All of this happened in junior high. That's what led me to read Helter Skelter, a book that gave me more nightmares than the very original Nightmare on Elm Street. This reading of Helter Skelter is my 4th time reading it. I read it for the 2nd time the summer before my junior year of high school. I distinctly remember because my mother grounded me from seeing my boyfriend. I guess I thought reading Helter Skelter would make me feel better about my current tragic state as a 16-year-old. Then I read it shortly after my mom died, which was about 14 years ago. When my dad moved, I snatched Helter Skelter from the bookshelf in the basement. I have kept it with my beloved books ever since. I read it shortly then after I got it. And then this time around makes 4. I must commend Bugliosi because even the 4th time around and already knowing a whole bunch more stuff about Helter Skelter, I couldn't put the book down. It's still riveting. The only other true crime book I remember rereading is Bitter Blood by Jerry Bledsoe, which I only bought after watching the 2-part TV movie which starred Harry Hamlin and Kelly McGillis. Otherwise, I can't imagine going back and rereading any of the many true crime books I've read over the years. There's just something about Helter Skelter. It's interesting when I read it this time, especially after reading Chaos, Charles Manson, the CIA, and the Secret History of the 60s by Tom O'Neill, which I read a couple of years ago. And I felt much more knowledgeable about the case now, even though I have watched several documentaries. And even before I read Chaos, I read Diane Lake's memoir, which was quite fascinating. I would not consider myself an expert regarding Charles Manson by any means because I'm sure there's many of you out there who can rattle off names and whatnot that I would have to go back and look at. But I am not a newbie when it comes to Helter Skelter. I will be referencing Chaos quite a bit throughout this Booksmart episode. If you haven't read it, you must, plain and simple. It's beyond fascinating. I'm not going to recount the crimes just because that seems a bit redundant. I'm going to focus more on how Bugliosi tells the story and my lingering questions from it. So let's start with the very first page, like the very first page. And there's not even a blank page or a title page. It says this: the story you are about to read will scare the hell out of you. Is this still in the newer editions? Bugliosi isn't wrong. I remember looking at that first page long before I was in 7th grade. My parents didn't swear often, and when they did, it had some power to it, so that alone was shocking. It's a savvy narrative choice on Bugliosi's part to have written that on the very first page. I've read many lawyers' books and their accounts of famous cases, some of which I've done here on Booksmart episodes. There are some commonalities to all of these lawyer books. They are a little full of themselves, which I suppose you have to be if you're a successful attorney. They are very verbose and spend more time belaboring an argumentative point and then skipping over more narrative stuff that is actually more interesting. And they like to point out all of those who don't do their jobs, whether it be police or other lawyers or judges. Bugliosi does all these things in his book. Another commonality with lawyer books, there's always a very poetic part of the book. Sometimes it's at the beginning, sometimes at the end. Sometimes it deals with the crime scene. Sometimes it deals with a revelation about the murders or the killers or some philosophical nugget. And when you read it, you wonder why the rest of the book wasn't written as such. So Bugliosi starts Helter Skelter with the crime scenes. And let me read you this because the tone and the style of writing definitely is not that throughout. And I have to be careful. My book is somewhat falling apart even though I taped it. As the three men reached the end of the parking area, they saw not one but two inert forms on the lawn. From a distance, they looked like mannequins that had been dipped in red paint, then tossed haphazardly on the grass. They seemed grotesquely out of place on the well-cared-for lawn and its landscape, shrubbery, flowers, and trees. To the right was the residence itself, long, rambling, looking more comfortable than ostentatious, the carriage light outside the main door shining brightly. Farther on, past the south end of the house, they could see a corner of the swimming pool shimmering blue-green in the morning light. Off to the side was a rustic wishing well. To the left was a split rail fence intertwined with Christmas tree lights still on, and beyond the fence was a sweeping panoramic view that stretched all the way from downtown Los Angeles to the beach. Out there, life was still going on. Here, it had stopped. It's like literary fiction, which then quickly vanishes as the story progresses. It's so strange why these lawyer books don't continue with that, which I find much more preferable, in my opinion, style of writing. I wish I would have reread Helter Skelter before reading Chaos, because when I read it this time, I was really searching for Bugliosi's manipulation of the evidence, particularly the Helter Skelter motive and the mind control stuff. So let's just start there. What better title for the book than Helter Skelter? But if it was just some random thing written on the door of a crime scene, it wouldn't have much power. If it's the motive, now we're talking. Bugliosi really pushes this in the book, and he even presents all the evidence as an argument to the reader, which I didn't always care for. I would have preferred a much more story-like approach to this rather than him constantly telling us, here's another clear piece of evidence that proves the Helter Skelter motive. Bugliosi tells us how shaky the motive is, and he kind of weakens it himself in a roundabout way. So, let me read you this. My apologies if it takes me longer to find the pages. It's kind of a long book. Okay. All the evidence was assembled so far. This far, I felt, pointed to one primary motive, Helter Skelter. It was far out, but then so were the murders themselves. It was admittedly bizarre, but from the first moment I was assigned to the case, I'd felt that for murders as bizarre as these, the motive itself would have to be almost equally strange, not something you'd find within the pages of a textbook on police science. The jury would never buy Helter Skelter, Aaron said, suggesting that we offer something they would understand. I told him it wouldn't take me 2 seconds to dump the whole Helter Skelter theory if he could find another motive in the evidence. Aaron, however, was right. The jury would never accept Helter Skelter as is. We were missing far too many bits and pieces and one all-important link. Presuming that Manson actually believed that he could start a race war with these acts, what would he, Charlie Manson, personally gain by it? To this I had no answer, and without it, the motive made no sense. So, what would Manson gain from it, other than the obvious chaos? The only argument you could take with this is the whole uprising, the black and white war, and that the people hidden in the middle of the desert will survive. That's what Manson preached to his loyal followers, but did he truly believe it himself? See, I don't think he did. I think Manson was wanting to be a Jim Jones or something, but he would never urge mass suicide because then who is going to do all his bidding? So I'm still not sure I fully understand Manson's gain from Helter Skelter. I don't see any scenario where he is hiding in the desert and not causing chaos. I see him hiding out in the desert to avoid arrest, but that's another story. But Bugliosi really pushes this motive. There are many mass murders we can't fully explain except that the people doing the murdering aren't mentally sound. So why such a push? The prosecution doesn't even have to prove a motive, although it certainly helps the jury out as to why a crime was committed. And I realize Bugliosi faces an unusual task. Charles Manson did not kill any of the 7 from the Tate LaBianca murders, so that is a unique conundrum. The mind control bit is interesting because Bugliosi brings up hypnosis several times. So I'm going to read you kind of a batch of pages here where one thing comes up and then another, and they're just little blips, but it's interesting nonetheless. Reporters were busy tracing the wanderings of the nomadic family and interviewing those members not in custody. I asked Gail to save the papers, knowing the interviews might be useful at a later date. Though still uncharged with the murders, Charles Manson had now taken center stage. Sandy. The first time I heard him sing, it was like an angel. Squeaky. He gave off a lot of magic, but he was sort of a changeling. He seemed to change every time I saw him. He seemed ageless. There was also interviews with acquaintances and relatives of the suspects. Joseph Krenwinkel recalled how in September 1967, his daughter Patricia left her Manhattan Beach apartment, her job, and her car, not even picking up a paycheck due to her, to join Manson. I am convinced he was some kind of hypnotist. Krenwinkel was not the only one to make that suggestion. Attorney Caballero talked to reporters outside the Santa Monica courtroom where his client had just entered a not guilty plea to the Hinman murder. Susan Atkins was under the hypnotic spell of Manson and had nothing to do with the murders despite her presence at the Hinman and Tate residences. Okay, so that's kind of the first little batch. And now let me read you this. Somewhere along the line, I wasn't sure how or where or when, Manson developed a control over his followers so all-encompassing that he could ask them to violate the ultimate taboo. Say, kill, and they would do it. And then, they try to rule out how the drugs really weren't, the issue. And then this next one deals with Paul Crockett and Brooks Poston. And they were 2 ranch hands at Spawn Ranch. And this is what he says. When Crockett first met young Poston, he was a zombie. The phrase was Poston's own. He said that he had wanted to leave the family many times, but Manson had a vice grip on his mind, and I couldn't break the grip. I didn't know how to leave. Crockett discovered that Manson had programmed all his people to the extent that they're just like him. He has put all kinds of things in their heads. I didn't believe it could be done, but he has done it, and I seen it working. Crockett began deprogramming Poston. He put him to work in his various mining ventures, built up his body, got him to thinking of other things than Manson. And then let me read you this last little bit, which I think draws a lot in chaos. Okay, so Kanarek is Manson's attorney, and he asks this doctor, now, do you know of any cases where someone has, other than in the Frankenstein type of picture, do you know where someone has sat down and programmed people to go out, let's say, and commit armed robberies, burglaries, assaults? Do you know of any such instances? The answer, yes. In one sense, that is what we do when we program soldiers in a war. The Army uses a peer group technique and the patriotic ideals that are instilled in citizens of a particular country to bring about this pattern of behavior. Okay, so yes, the military uses it. Bugliosi just kind of throws it out there several times, but doesn't really develop it. I don't know if I believe the mind control experiment or not, although Chaos brought up several interesting points. But this next passage, I just don't know what to deal with. So Bugliosi reminds us, the reader, that Charles Manson was nothing but a cold-blooded murderer. Sure, he was good at influencing people and conning psychologists and parole officers and what have you, but Manson isn't Jesus, no matter how many followers think that he is. Yet Bugliosi shares this sort of supernatural experience, and I have to read it to you because it's just creepy, and it sort of just makes you pause and think. I don't know, think whatever. Okay, so at 11 a.m. on December 11th, buckskin-clad Charles Manson was brought before Judge William Keene. The courtroom was so packed with reporters and spectators you couldn't have squeezed another person in with a shoehorn. Since Manson lacked funds to hire an attorney, Keene appointed Paul Fitzgerald of the Public Defender's Office to represent him. I'd come up against Paul before on several jury trials and knew he had a good reputation in his office. Manson was arraigned and a postponement granted until December 22nd for the entering of his plea. In Independence, Sandra Good had told me that once in the desert, Charlie had picked up a dead bird, breathed on it, and the bird had flown away. Sure, Sandy, sure, I replied. Since then, I'd heard a great deal about Manson's alleged powers. Susan Atkins, for example, felt he could see and hear everything she did or said. Midway through the arraignment, I looked at my watch. It had stopped. Odd. It was the first time I could remember that happening. Then I noticed that Manson was staring at me, a slight grin on his face. It was, I told myself, simply a coincidence. It's just creepy and highly unsettling. And I remember when the detective for John Wayne Gacy came to speak at my college, and he talked about weird stuff happening at his house the night Gacy was put to death. I don't know. So Bugliosi just doesn't seem like the kind of guy who believes in ghosts and the devil and whatnot, but the passage just creeps me out. I've always wondered this, which Bugliosi doesn't really explain. If Helter Skelter was the motive, why did Manson order 2 consecutive nights of murders and then just stop? First off, it's beyond alarming that the police saw zero connection between the Tate and LaBianca murders. How could you not? It's also alarming that the gun, which was the murder weapon, the police did nothing about. The father of the boy who found the gun had to call the police again, not to mention a TV news crew found bloody clothes the murderers wore. I just have no words. But if Helter Skelter was truly the motive, and obviously the police had nothing much to go on if Manson and the family weren't arrested for murder until 2 months later, although they were arrested during the raid on Spahn Ranch just a week after the murders. So why did Manson just stop? If Tex Watson and Susan Atkins kind of had flaked out on him, he could have gotten Squeaky to do absolutely anything for him. If we believe the mind control theory, did someone else pull the plug on the experiment? I don't know. We always end up with more questions than answers. And was it random or not? So Bugliosi spends quite a bit of time outlining that Manson knew the houses and the neighborhoods. He spends a lot of time finding witnesses and evidence that shows that Manson was at the Tate house prior to the murders, that the creepy crawlies that the family did was in preparation for murder. Yet then, when Bugliosi shares with us that the night of the LaBianca murders, the family split into 2 groups. While Watson went into the LaBianca house, Manson took the other half and they were going to commit another murder. But the house Manson found had children's pictures in it, and he didn't want to kill children, not yet, although it may need to happen in the future, according to him. And I have to stop here for a second so I can get this off my chest because it's bothered me forever. Sharon Tate's baby was due any day. This was a full-term baby. So why wasn't anyone charged with the death of the baby? Bugliosi lists the names of the 7 victims many times throughout the book. 5 at the Tate house and 2 at the LaBiancas. Shouldn't it be 8? At 8.5 months pregnant, Sharon Tate's baby wouldn't have even been considered a preemie. This is a full-term baby. And remember, Roe versus Wade didn't happen until 1973. So you're telling me that a woman could be charged criminally if she got an abortion even long before 24 weeks into the pregnancy, but then someone murders a pregnant woman with a full-term baby and it is only charged with 1 murder. And we don't even recognize the baby as a murder victim. It's just food for thought, people. Food for thought. Okay, so going back to the night of the LaBianca murders, Bugliosi lets us know that anybody could have been targeted by Manson. Anyone out walking around or riding their bike or whatever. But in the Tate murders in particular, at least the way Bugliosi writes about it, it wasn't random. However, I'm more interested as to why Manson didn't kill that night. Tex Watson did. Why didn't Manson? We know Manson had killed before, so why didn't he that night? I don't know. Bugliosi seems so insistent that Helter Skelter was the motive, that the race war was the ultimate goal. Was this coming from someone above Bugliosi? If Manson was part of some government experiment, why not just get rid of Manson? They've done it before, right? None of it makes any sense. And maybe that's part of the problem. There really wasn't a motive, maybe. Just a crazy, sadistic, murderous guy who got people to kill for him. I don't know. We'll never know, but only hypothesize. Okay, so we need to talk about 2 things that have never sat well with me. The first one is Terry Melcher. My first readings of Helter Skelter, I gave Terry Melcher little thought. I was more befuddled that Murphy Brown, who I watched, Murphy Brown, was somehow tied to the Tate murders or had some weird connection, but Melcher's involvement never quite comes full circle for me. Bugliosi even says that Melcher was hiding something, and then in his brilliance, he gets Melcher to spill his guts. But Bugliosi specifically writes that, out of everyone, Melcher was the most terrified of Manson. Bugliosi states both these contradicting ideas, that Manson wanted to get back at Melcher for not following through on the record deal, yet Manson knew Melcher no longer lived at the Cielo Drive house. Chaos tells us that Melcher couldn't have been that scared of Manson because he visited him 3 times after the murders, something Bugliosi does not speak of. So what don't we still know about Melcher, Manson, and Bugliosi? O'Neill in Chaos tells us that no one in Hollywood would talk to him. And it's interesting because other than Dennis Wilson, Bugliosi doesn't talk to anyone either, despite his intensive investigation, an investigation that he reminds us the police really haven't done, so he has to go out and do it himself. He loves racking up the drama, naming all those celebrities who were allegedly on some hit list by Manson, but Bugliosi doesn't appear to interrogate many in Hollywood, nor really track the links of all these people to Manson. I think there's something more to the Hollywood connection. I don't know what it is. And on a side note, Bugliosi discusses the sex tape of Sharon Tate, and his version of what is on the tape is much different than what O'Neill says in Chaos. The second thing that has never sat well with me is Tex Watson. I remember way back in junior high when I read the book for the first time, wondering why Tex Watson's trial was reduced to just a handful of pages, especially when Bugliosi spends so much time repeating information in the penalty phase of the trial. As far as I'm concerned, Tex Watson was kind of the second in command. He dictated both murder scenes because Manson wasn't there when the murders were occurring. We're pretty sure of that. Yet Bugliosi spends so little time developing Watson. I think more space is devoted to Squeaky, who didn't participate in the murders, than Watson. Bugliosi repeats several times all the witnesses' interview tapes and how long the tapes were and what was on them and how they compared to his investigation. But Tex Watson, it's just empty space. Chaos told us that Watson's initial police interview tapes have never been released, even though the family has requested them. You then have Watson's odd behavior, his refusal to eat, his sudden clean-cut appearance, Bugliosi thinking Watson is going for the insanity defense, yet he doesn't develop Watson at all. We never hear all of Watson's side of the story. Bugliosi just throws in at the end how Watson's version of events, well, it essentially matches what Bugliosi's evidence and motive says. So why didn't he spend much time on Watson? He's long-winded with a lot of information, some of which could have been condensed and summarized. He repeats himself a lot as well, but Watson is just sort of glossed over. Why is that? I think there's something in Watson's initial interview that didn't fit with the narrative of the crime. What that is, I have no idea. From my reading of Chaos, the one thing I found most compelling was the parole officer, how Manson's and later Susan Atkins' parole was never revoked, no matter how many times Manson violated the conditions of his parole. And so here's an interesting exchange that Bugliosi has with another person regarding this parole. And I kind of wish more time would have been developed on this because it's really sort of awful. Kinnaird did not use Charles Manson's mother as a witness. Instead, he called Samuel Barrett, Manson's parole officer. Barrett was a most unimpressive witness. He thought he first met Manson about 1956, around that. He couldn't remember whether Manson was on probation or parole. He stated that since he was responsible for 150 persons, he couldn't be expected to recall everything about each one. Repeatedly, Barrett minimized the seriousness of the various charges against Manson prior to the murders. The reason he did this was obvious. Otherwise, one might wonder why he hadn't revoked Manson's parole. One still did wonder. Manson associated with ex-cons, known narcotic users, and minor girls. He failed to report his whereabouts, made few attempts to obtain employment, repeatedly lied regarding his activities. During the first 6 months of 1969 alone, he had been charged, among other things, with grand theft auto, narcotics possession, rape, contributing to the delinquency of a minor. There was more than ample reason for parole revocation. During a recess, one of the reporters approached me in the hall. "God, Vince," he exclaimed, "did it ever occur to you that if Barrett had revoked Manson's parole in, say, April of 1969, Sharon and the others would probably still be alive today?" I declined to comment, citing the gag order as an excuse, but it had occurred to me, and I had thought about it a great deal. So this is beyond terrifying. So chaos interprets this more with the mind control experiment than incompetence or a thought divulge our judicial system, but I teach at a juvenile detention center and see this all the time. Some students with very violent charges somehow go on community supervision, and then guess what? When they come back for another crime at JDC, it's even more serious than the one before. I don't understand why parole and or probation are so flexible and forgiving. And on a side note, I think Roger Smith, when I went back and looked at my notes, was the parole officer in question in Chaos. He only had Manson as a client or whatever, and this is another guy. So I don't know how they exactly connect there. Since my copy of the book was the 1975 version, last month when I went to Barnes & Noble, I saw the newer edition had a new afterword by Bugliosi. Of course, when I went back to Barnes & Noble recently to read it, all the copies of Helter Skelter were gone. So let me applaud Bugliosi again. Yes, I think he will always have the all-time best-selling true crime book ever. But I also noticed that all the copies of Chaos were gone too. I looked online through my library system and they had multiple holds for both books. After all these years, people are still reading Helter Skelter and now wanting to read Chaos. Lucky for me, on Amazon, the sample pages of Helter Skelter included the whole afterword, so I was able to read it. As always, Bugliosi was long-winded, but it's mostly touting his own horn, which I guess I don't blame him. I guess I would too if I were him. Bugliosi tries to explain why Manson fascinates us more so than other serial killers and mass murderers, how bizarre the case was, and how there's still this mystery surrounding Manson. One of his theories is that Manson marked the end of the hippie era, ending the decade of love, although it's hard to believe that with all the awful stuff happening in the 1960s, that was the decade of love. Bugliosi reiterates, using an expert doctor's conclusion, that never has such a phenomenon been seen before. To kill complete strangers at Manson's command. The mind control theory just seems to fit sometimes. Bugliosi also describes how Manson has been turned into an icon, how he's now known for his music, how his murders aren't so much frowned upon by some. I remember when Guns N' Roses came out with that Look at Your Game Girl, and that was just tacky. I still think it's tacky. I don't care if one of the victims' families gets the profits, but herein lies a question. What if Bugliosi hadn't written Helter Skelter? Would the Manson murders have faded with time? I don't know. I will say I have students who talk about Charles Manson. They can't tell me much about Abraham Lincoln, but they know who Manson is. It's just not good. So I love when I read books, especially very old books, and there's so much that applies to our current times. So I found a couple of fascinating tidbits, and here's something I found, especially when we're talking about our very divisive society right now and our reliance on social media and AI and algorithms and the havoc they are causing. And it just struck me, perhaps in an odd way, but let me share it with you. Yet, once in the desert, Jacobson had run over a tarantula and Manson had angrily berated him for it. He had denounced others for killing rattlesnakes, picking flowers, even stepping on a blade of grass. To Manson, it was not wrong to kill a human being, but it was wrong to kill an animal or plant. Yet, he also said that nothing was wrong. Everything that happened was right. That Manson's philosophy was riddled with such contradictions apparently bothered his followers little, if at all. Manson said that each person should be independent, but the whole family was dependent on him. He said that he couldn't tell anyone else what to do, but they should do what your love tells you. But he also told them, I am your love, and his wants became theirs. It's just fascinating. Let me read you this next part. That also is kind of like, oh, how fascinating. So how did Charles Manson, get people to do his bidding? Okay. He used repetition. By constantly preaching and lecturing to his subjects on an almost daily basis, he gradually and systematically erased many of their inhibitions. As Manson himself once remarked in court, you can convince anybody of anything if you just push it at them all the time. They may not believe it 100%, but they will still draw opinions from it, especially if they have no other information to draw their opinions from. That's what Charles Manson said. Okay? And that's why algorithms are so scary and damaging and whatever. Okay. So at times, Bugliosi is difficult to figure out. His obvious tone toward Manson is one of disgust and contempt, yet he seems to brag about Manson's praise. It's just rather unsettling. And I don't think Bugliosi gives us a full background on Manson. Every other source loves to cite that Manson read How to Win Friends and Influence People when he was in prison, but Bugliosi never mentions this. I know it's a rather small thing, but Bugliosi is very inconsistent at times with what he develops and what he doesn't develop. So Bugliosi died in 2015. As he aged, I wonder what if his opinion changed on the narrative he wove of the Manson murders. According to O'Neill's Chaos, Bugliosi started out friendly and helpful, then turned on O'Neill when he started uncovering too much. Bugliosi even spread rumors that O'Neill was a pedophile and essentially acted like a big baby. So what information is still out there that we don't know? Why the cover-up if there was one? Unfortunately, we'll never know what Bugliosi knew and never shared. Maybe someday we can hear the Tex Watson tapes. Until then, conspiracy theories will fill in the gaps to give us more acceptable explanations for one of the most bizarre murder cases in U.S. history. I'm going to leave you with a final passage, and it's chilling and it's terrifying in our world today. And it's, I don't know, you can decide for yourself. All of these factors contributed to Manson's control over others. But when you add them all up, do they equal murder without remorse? Maybe. But I tend to think that there is something more missing link that enabled him to so rape and bastardize the minds of his followers that they would go against the most ingrained of all commandments. Thou shalt not kill, and willingly, even eagerly, murder at his command. It may be something in his charismatic, enigmatic personality, some intangible quality or power that no one has yet been able to isolate and identify. It may be something he learned from others. Whatever it is, I believe Manson has full knowledge of the formula he used. And it worries me that we do not. For the frightening legacy of the Manson case is that it could happen again. I believe Charles Manson is unique. He is certainly one of the most fascinating criminals in American history, and it appears unlikely that there will ever be another mass murderer quite like it. But it does not take a prophet to see at least some of the potentials of his madness in the world today. Whenever people unquestioningly turn over their minds to authoritarian figures to do with as they please, whether it be in a satanic cult or some of the more fanatic offshoots of the Jesus movement, in the right wing or the far left, or in the mind-bending cults of the new sensitivity, those potentials exist. One hopes that none of these groups will spawn other Charles Mansons, but it would be naive to suggest that the chilling possibility does not exist. Thanks for watching. As always, my goal at Booksmart is to get a little bit smarter, one book at a time.